So, following the idea of continentality, we have a couple of bodies of water that are very important to the region. The first is the Caspian Sea, and the Caspian Sea is actually the world's largest lake because a lake is a body of water that is surrounded by land on all sides. And so the Caspian Sea doesn't have a direct connection to any ocean, so it's a lake. It's a really big lake. It's the world's largest lake. It's really big. And it's so important because of that little thing right out there, that oil rig. Because oil is brutally important to all the countries that border the Caspian Sea. That includes Russia, Azerbaijan, Iran, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan. As you see, the little oil wells on the map here kind of demonstrate that. And they have to get that oil from the Caspian Sea to the countries that consume a lot of oil, like Europe. So they have to build pipelines across parts of these countries, and that creates some issues, and we'll get to those issues a little later on. We also have the Aral Sea, which is a sadder story than the Caspian Sea because the Aral Sea is in a more continental location than the Caspian Sea. It is limited on the amount of rainfall and water that it gets. So, in the past 50 years, the people who live around the Aral Sea have discovered that they can use the water that was intended to go to this sea and use it to water crops and new land instead. Because the soil there is fine, it's so dry it's hard to grow most crops. So what they've done is this river right here, the Amudara. I think I'm a little vague right now on the actual river, but this river right here, which is in this photograph, and then it's over here too, or maybe the Sirdara, whichever one. Um, they've decided to start diverting some of the water off of that river, and over time, the lake has shrunk. So as you see the difference between the 1964 map and the 2002 map, now there's three small bodies of water instead of one large one. So a port city is no longer a port city. It's doubled in salinity. That means the amount of salt in the sea has doubled because of evaporation. And that's killed most of the fish that live in the Aral Sea. As you see, this is an area now of what the Aral Sea was. There are places that used to be ports on the Aral Sea that are now 200 miles from the Aral Sea. So that's, there they are, the Sirdara, Darya, and the Amudara. Anyway, the Sirdara is the one that's the most important, though. Anyway, here's a guy who's lived through all of this. He's seen all this, and he said they used to be able to catch over 200 pounds of fish, but now they can't. And he doesn't understand why. He doesn't understand the whole idea of the water we're using to water the crops upstream is killing the sea downstream. We also have Lake Baikal. It's the third body of water I wanted to mention, and it's important because it is the world's deepest lake. There is more fresh water in Lake Baikal than any other lake in the world. It doesn't look all that big, but where it's located is actually on a border between two tectonic plates. So it's actually a rift zone lake, like some of the rift zone lakes we'll look at in Africa. But its depth, they haven't got, no one has gotten to the complete bottom of Lake Baikal. So there may be wildlife or fish that exist way down deep in Lake Baikal that we've never seen before. So now we move into Russian history, and Russian history starts out with the Slavs, and the Slavs were this ancient tribe, I guess you would say, that started around where Belarus is today. And they slowly moved south and expanded out into parts of Poland and what was Yugoslavia and into what becomes Russia today. Um, the Golden Horde comes in, Genghis Khan's group, and moves this group further south into what is now the Ukraine. And from there, they start expanding further out after the Golden Horde is defeated. There's the Golden Horde. There they are. As you see, the Golden Horde, which we'll get more to when we look at China, was huge. It was massive. It ran from Poland to almost Japan. That's a huge piece of territory, which today Russia covers most of that. But they were all ruled by the Mongols right here in Karakoram. Ivan the Terrible was the conqueror of the Mongols. He's the one that really defeated them and pushed them out. And in the process, he moved Russian culture from Belarus, Ukraine, more toward Moscow being the central. And some of the help he got was from these people called the Cossacks or the Kazakhs, who were more Asian in their heritage, and they still have this traditional dress, which is the traditional dress we think of when we think of Russians, but no, they dress like us. They don't dress like this all the time. There's just a small group of Cossacks that the Tsar leader of Russia had like an agreement with, and they would fight for him. And anyway, it was a deal that they'd had. As we move forward in time, we move into the 1600s and 1700s, we get to Peter the Great. And Peter the Great actually took Russia and moved it away from an Asian focus toward more of a European focus. And in doing that, he decided one of the things he wanted to do was create a gateway toward Russia. And in the process, he moved the Russian establishment to build a port here on the Gulf of Finland, where the city of St. Petersburg is today. Yeah, he even named the city after himself. So that was his big push, was to push toward St. Petersburg, or to create St. Petersburg, and it started as that. He even wanted to model men's fashion after the other European powers. So he wanted to dress like the folks from Austria, Hungary, and France. He even banned beards, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard because I love my beard. But he decided men should wear mustaches because that's what Europeans wear. So that's what they did. Further, we move into Catherine the Great. And Catherine the Great even extended the Russian Empire further, pushing further south to warm water ports. Because with the Russian Empire, if this is the only port on this side, where St. Petersburg was, it gets cold for 3, 4, 5, 6 months out of the year, and you may not be able to get ships in and out of the port up here. So she pushed for a port on the Black Sea, because the Black Sea doesn't freeze over like the Baltic Sea does. So she pushed for a southern access for her navy so they could explore. In the 1860s, you have the freeing of the serfs. And serfs were people that lived on the land for these rich warlords or rich lords of Russia. And what they did is they had to pay a tax or a tribute with the crops they grew. And there was a proclamation that emancipated them in the 1860s that freed them from having to pay tribute to the landlords of Russia. It was similar to the Emancipation Proclamation that was issued by Abraham Lincoln. So you see an expansion of Russian territory. This is in 1462. It was just around Moscow, and it extends out further by the 1600s, and then further across Siberia, and eventually they actually went into Alaska, which was sold to the U.S. In the late 1800s. But you also see an expansion by Peter the Great trying to get through St. Petersburg, Catherine the Great moving to take over this area here by the 1800s, and then by 1947 they had conquered the steppe region and the area north of China, and this little tip right here of the Baltic Sea, sorry, the Barents Sea. This is a really cool map that shows how in the early 1800s, Napoleon tried to invade Russia. And one of the old adages now is never get in a land war with Russia. Because this map shows that he started over here and moved his way, and this line is actually the size of his troops. And he tried invading in October. And as he invaded, the year grew on and the temperatures got colder. And his men were ill equipped for this. And the Russians kept burning up all the supplies, leading the Napoleonic army further and further toward Moscow. So by the time they got to Moscow, they had no supplies and very few men. So they basically had to turn around and head back in this really brutal winter that they were not prepared for. So they did. So by the time they got back, this was the amount of troops they had left. This little bitty line compared to this big line here. So this is something that's important for Napoleon. And later on, when we see Hitler trying to invade Russia, you have a similar issue with trying to get in a land war in Russia, which still doesn't work. So we have the rise of Russia, we have World War I, and during the middle of World War I, we have this revolution. Russia basically fights to a stalemate against Germany, and while this is going on, a civil war erupts in 1917 in Russia, and you have this Bolshevik revolution, the whites versus the reds, which they fight to kill the king of Russia, the emperor of Russia. And then they have their own civil war trying to determine, okay, now who's going to lead us, the whites or the reds? And in doing this, the reds actually win, and that's the communist group that's led by Lenin. And the whites were actually led by a guy named Trotsky. And Trotsky ended up moving away from Russia, ended up moving to Mexico, where he was killed by one of Lenin's agents later on. So we have Lenin, he dies and passes the mantle on to Stalin, this guy down here, who is very intolerant of religions, and particularly Muslims and Jews, and he actually ends up killing 20 million of his own people before, during, and after World War II. Many of the people who opposed him were actually sent to Siberian camps or killed. And after World War II, he helps create the Warsaw Pact, which the Warsaw Pact is an agreement with him and the satellite countries that are around the Soviet Union at this time that collectively grow and supply each other through a form of socialism.